Sometimes life gives us one perfect night, a moment so complete, so transcendent, that it shapes the entire trajectory of our existence. This is the story of two people who experienced that miracle, and then spent 27 years carrying it in their hearts, never knowing that fate would be kind enough to bring them together again. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's Grand Hall was nearly empty by the time Victor Kensington arrived. October in Manhattan carried a particular weight, the kind that made people move slower, think deeper, as if the changing season demanded something more introspective from those who inhabited the city. The autumn gala had been scheduled months in advance, one of those obligatory events that came with the Kensington name. His mother had insisted. There were certain things one simply did not refuse when one's family had been part of New York's fabric for generations. Victor stood near one of the towering columns, watching the remaining guests with the detached observation of someone who had attended hundreds of such events and found them all equally hollow. At 52, he had perfected the art of being present while remaining fundamentally absent. His tailored charcoal suit fit impeccably. His silver cufflinks caught the light of the crystal chandeliers. His posture was impeccable. To anyone observing him, he appeared exactly as he always did. Composed, controlled, the kind of man who had learned early that showing genuine emotion was often mistaken for weakness. The past 3 decades had been kind to him in the material sense. The family business had flourished under his stewardship. Kensington and Associates had expanded significantly, making him one of the most influential figures in Manhattan's business landscape. He'd made shrewd investments, navigated market fluctuations with the kind of intuition that came from generations of accumulated wealth and knowledge. He'd also married a woman named Catherine, whom he'd met through mutual friends. They'd had 2 children together, both now in their 20s. The marriage had been comfortable, predictable, entirely devoid of passion. They'd divorced 7 years ago, with the same civility they'd maintained throughout their union. But there was something else that Victor carried with him through those 3 decades, something that no amount of professional success or material accumulation could diminish. It was a memory so vivid, so perfectly preserved in the amber of his consciousness, that even now, after 27 years, he could close his eyes and return to it completely. A single night. One impossible, perfect night that had somehow shaped the entire emotional trajectory of his life, even as he'd lived a completely different existence on the surface. He was reaching for another glass of champagne when he felt it, not saw it, felt it. That peculiar sensation of recognition that transcends logic, that operates on some frequency deeper than sight or sound. It was the same feeling he'd experienced once before, decades ago, in a ballroom that had been emptied of everyone but 2 people. Victor turned. She was standing near the entrance to the main hall, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. Not because she was the most beautiful woman there, though she was undeniably striking, but because of the way time itself seemed to fold. Her dark hair, now touched with threads of silver that caught the light beautifully, was swept to one side. She wore a deep emerald dress that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. Her eyes, those same eyes that had looked at him with such intensity on a single, perfect night, scanned the room with the analytical gaze of someone still accustomed to framing moments, to finding meaning in composition and light. Olivia Rose, at 50 years old, carried herself with the quiet confidence of a woman who had spent 3 decades behind a camera lens, observing the world rather than performing for it. She was speaking with someone, a woman he didn't recognize, but her attention seemed divided, as if part of her was always elsewhere, always searching for something just beyond the frame. And then she laughed. It was a real laugh, not the practiced social performance he heard constantly at these events. Something in Victor's chest twisted with a pain so acute it felt like grief. He recognized that laugh. He had heard it only once before, but it had lived in his memory with the clarity of something experienced yesterday rather than 27 years ago. That sound transported him instantly backward, as if time itself had collapsed. The memory seized him with such force that for a moment he was no longer standing in the museum's grand hall. He was 23 years old again, and the world was entirely different. The wedding reception at the Plaza Hotel had been winding down for hours. The orchestra had played their final set. The bride and groom had departed for their honeymoon. The guests had dispersed into the Manhattan night, leaving behind only the detritus of celebration: empty champagne glasses, wilted flowers, the faint echo of laughter that seemed to linger in the air like a ghost. Young Victor had retreated to one of the smaller adjoining rooms, a space designed for intimate gatherings but now empty and cavernous. He was loosening his tie, feeling the particular exhaustion that comes from hours of performing social niceties, when he heard the footsteps. They were quick, purposeful, the footsteps of someone searching for something with focused determination. She appeared in the doorway like something conjured from the loneliness of the moment. Olivia Rose was 21 years old, still wearing her wedding guest dress, a simple navy gown that somehow managed to be both elegant and understated. Her dark hair was slightly disheveled, and her eyes held an expression of focused intensity that immediately caught his attention. There was something about the way she moved through the space, the way she looked at things, not casually, but with genuine attention, as if she was cataloging details, searching for meaning in composition and light. She was looking for something. That much was immediately apparent. Her eyes swept across the room, moving from the floor to the tables to the windowsills. She knelt down near one of the chairs, her fingers trailing across the carpet, and then she stood again, her expression shifting from hope to frustration. She had lost a ring with a small diamond, set in gold, given to her by her mother when she turned 18. A ring that meant something. A ring that represented luck, or hope, or the possibility of finding what matters in a life that often felt like it was being lived according to someone else's script. Young Victor watched her for a moment before moving toward her. There was something about her that made him want to help, to ease her worry, to be the kind of person who could make things better. She looked up as he approached, and their eyes met. In that moment, something shifted in the universe. It was a sensation he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. A feeling of recognition so complete, so overwhelming, that it felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. They searched together, moving through the ballroom with a shared purpose that quickly became secondary to something else entirely. They talked as they searched, about photography, about the weight of family expectations, about the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who didn't truly see you. Young Victor found himself telling her things he had never told anyone, and she listened with the kind of attention that felt like being truly witnessed for the first time in his life. The ring was eventually found near the edge of the dance floor, glinting under the fading light of the chandeliers. But by then, neither of them particularly cared about the ring anymore. What had begun as a search for a lost object had become something else entirely. A conversation that felt like it had been waiting to happen. A connection that seemed to transcend the simple fact of two people meeting for the first time. When they finally left the ballroom, it was because the staff had begun turning off the lights. They walked out into the Manhattan night, and without discussing it, without any conscious decision, they simply continued walking. The city at midnight was a different place than it was during the day, quieter, more intimate, as if it had revealed its true self only after the crowds had dispersed. They walked for hours, through the Upper East Side, down Fifth Avenue, across the Brooklyn Bridge. They talked about everything and nothing. They talked about dreams that felt too fragile to speak aloud in daylight. They talked about the way the city looked different depending on the angle of the light, the way a single moment could contain entire lifetimes of meaning. And as they walked, something profound was happening between them. Something that transcended the simple mechanics of attraction or chemistry. It was as if they had recognized in each other a fundamental truth about themselves. A mirror that reflected back not who they pretended to be, but who they actually were. By the time they reached Coney Beach, the sky was beginning to lighten with the approach of dawn. They sat on the sand, and at some point, without conscious decision, They simply held each other as the night deepened around them. It had been innocent and profound at once. No passion beyond the simple miracle of being truly known by another person, of being seen completely and accepted entirely. The sun was just beginning to break over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed almost unreal in their beauty. Young Victor lay sleeping on the sand, his tuxedo jacket discarded nearby, his shirt unbuttoned and rumpled. His breathing was deep and peaceful, the sleep of someone who had experienced something so profound that his body had simply shut down to process it. Olivia stood a few feet away, fully dressed now, her shoes in her hand, her eyes fixed on his sleeping face with an expression of such tenderness, such anguish, that it seemed to contain the entire spectrum of human longing. She had been standing there for 10 minutes, perhaps longer. She couldn't bring herself to leave, but she knew she had to. The night had been perfect. After finding the ring in the ballroom, they had left the hotel and walked through the sleeping city, talking until the streets began to lighten with the approach of dawn. They had ended up at Coney Beach, sitting on the sand, and at some point, without conscious decision, they had simply held each other as the night deepened around them. It had been innocent and profound at once. No passion beyond the simple miracle of being truly known by another person, of being seen completely and accepted entirely. But as the sun began to rise, Olivia had felt the weight of reality pressing down. She was 21 years old, a freelance photographer just beginning her career, with no stability, no future to offer. Victor was a Kensington, heir to a fortune, bound by obligations and expectations she could never fully understand. They had spent one perfect night together, and that night had shown her something essential about love. That it was possible to feel completely connected to another person. That it was possible to be truly understood. But she also understood, with the clarity that comes from youth and wisdom in equal measure, that some perfect things were meant to exist only in their perfection. To try to extend them, to try to build a life around them, would only diminish what they had been. So she left him sleeping. She left him a note. Just a few words, nothing that could adequately capture what she felt, but something to let him know that the night had been real, that she had not simply vanished like a dream. She walked away from the beach as the sun continued to rise, and she did not look back. Back to reality, Victor felt his breath catch in his throat. The memory released him as suddenly as it had seized him, and he found himself standing once again in the museum's grand hall, his hand frozen mid-air, his entire body trembling with an emotion so profound that it felt almost unbearable. Olivia had turned away from her conversation. She was moving toward the restroom corridor, her movements careful, deliberate, as if she was trying not to fall apart. Victor watched her go, and without conscious decision, his feet began to carry him forward. He followed her into the quieter corridor, where the sounds of the gala seemed to fade into the distance, replaced by the soft hum of the museum's climate control and the faint echo of footsteps on marble. She stood near one of the tall windows, her back to him, her shoulders tense. She didn't turn around when he approached, but he knew she was aware of him. He could feel it in the way her breathing had changed, in the subtle shift of her posture. He said her name, and the sound of it felt like a prayer, like a question, like an answer, all at once. She turned slowly. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and her expression held a complexity of emotion that he recognized because he felt it too. Shock, longing, grief, and something else. Something that transcended the simple categories of human feeling. It was the look of someone confronting a ghost, or perhaps confronting the ghost of who they might have been. Neither of them moved to touch the other. There was something sacred about the space between them. Something that suggested that crossing it might shatter the fragile reality of this moment. Instead, they simply stood there, two people in their 50s, looking at each other with the intensity of lovers who had been separated by time and circumstance, but never, not truly, by the heart. Around them, the museum continued its evening, oblivious to the fact that something fundamental was shifting in the universe, that two people who had been separated by time and circumstance were being given, impossibly, a second chance. The moment their eyes met in that empty ballroom, something shifted in the fabric of reality itself. It was not the kind of moment that could be explained through the conventional language of attraction or chemistry. It was something far more profound, a recognition so complete that it felt like remembering something that had never happened, like meeting someone you had always known. Young Victor, at 23, had spent his entire life being told who he was supposed to be. The Kensington name came with expectations that had been carefully cultivated across generations. He was meant to be composed, controlled, emotionally restrained. He was meant to marry someone from an appropriate family, produce heirs, and maintain the family legacy with the kind of efficiency that came from generations of accumulated privilege. He had never questioned these expectations. They had simply been the landscape of his existence, as immutable as gravity. But then she appeared in that doorway, searching for a lost ring, and everything he thought he knew about himself suddenly seemed negotiable. Olivia Rose, at 21, carried herself with the kind of authenticity that was rare in the circles Victor inhabited. She was not performing for anyone. She was not calculating her words or her movements. She was simply present, genuinely present, in a way that made everyone else at the gala seem like actors playing predetermined roles. When she looked at him, she was not seeing the Kensington name or the family fortune. She was seeing him, the actual person beneath the tailored suit and the carefully maintained composure. They searched for the ring together, moving through the ballroom with a shared purpose that quickly became secondary to something else entirely. As they searched, they began to talk. Not the kind of superficial conversation that dominated social gatherings, but real conversation, the kind that peeled back layers and revealed truth. Young Victor found himself telling her things he had never articulated before, things that lived in the quiet corners of his consciousness, but had never been spoken aloud. He told her about the weight of expectations, about the way his life had been planned out before he was old enough to have opinions about it. He told her about the loneliness of being surrounded by people who saw him as a name rather than a person. He told her about the particular ache of knowing that his choices had already been made for him, that his future had been written in the language of duty and obligation, rather than desire and passion. And she listened. Not with the polite attention people usually offered at social gatherings, but with genuine interest. She asked questions that suggested she was truly trying to understand him, not just waiting for her turn to speak. She shared her own fears and dreams, about her photography, about the uncertainty of trying to build a career in a field that offered no guarantees, about the pressure from her family to pursue something more stable, more respectable. The ring was eventually found near the edge of the dance floor, glinting under the fading light of the chandeliers. But by then, neither of them particularly cared about the ring anymore. What had begun as a search for a lost object had become something else entirely. A conversation that felt like it had been waiting to happen. A connection that seemed to transcend the simple fact of two people meeting for the first time. When they finally left the ballroom, it was because the staff had begun turning off the lights. They walked out into the Manhattan night, and without discussing it, without any conscious decision, they simply continued walking. The city at midnight was a different place than it was during the day. Quieter, more intimate, as if it had revealed its true self only after the crowds had dispersed. They walked for hours. Through the Upper East Side, down Fifth Avenue, across the Brooklyn Bridge. The city unfolded around them like a story being told for the first time. They talked about everything and nothing. They talked about dreams that felt too fragile to speak aloud in daylight. They talked about the way the city looked different depending on the angle of the light, the way a single moment could contain entire lifetimes of meaning. They talked about photography and business and family and fear and hope, and all the things that people rarely discuss with strangers, but that somehow felt essential to share with each other. And as they walked, something profound was happening between them, something that transcended the simple mechanics of attraction or chemistry. It was as if they had recognized in each other a fundamental truth about themselves, a mirror that reflected back not who they pretended to be, but who they actually were. With each step, with each word exchanged, the connection between them deepened. It was not a gradual process. It was sudden and complete, as if they had been moving toward this moment their entire lives without knowing it. By the time they reached Coney Beach, the sky was beginning to lighten with the approach of dawn. The city had receded behind them, and they were alone in a way that felt almost sacred. They sat on the sand, and at some point, without conscious decision, they simply held each other as the night deepened around them. It had been innocent and profound at once. No passion beyond the simple miracle of being truly known by another person, of being seen completely and accepted entirely. Young Victor felt something shift inside him as he held her. It was not the kind of feeling that could be easily categorized or explained. It was larger than love, more fundamental than desire. It was the sensation of meeting your own soul in another person, of recognizing in them something that had always been missing from your own existence. He had spent 23 years being told who he was supposed to be, and in a single night, this woman had shown him who he actually was. Not the Kensington heir, not the carefully groomed product of generations of wealth and expectation, but simply a human being capable of genuine connection, genuine understanding, genuine love. For Olivia, the experience was equally transformative. She had spent 21 years feeling like an outsider in her own family, like someone who didn't quite fit the mold that had been prepared for her. Her family wanted her to be practical, to pursue a career that offered stability and respectability, but she had always felt called to something else, to the pursuit of beauty, to the capture of moments that revealed truth. With Victor, she felt seen in a way she had never experienced before. He didn't try to convince her to be different. He didn't suggest that her dreams were impractical or foolish. He simply listened, and in listening, he validated the essential truth of who she was. As the night progressed, they talked about the future. Not their future together. Neither of them dared to articulate that possibility, but their futures as individuals. Victor spoke about the weight of family expectations, about the life that had been mapped out for him, about his fear that he would never be able to deviate from the predetermined path. Olivia spoke about her dreams of becoming a photographer, about the uncertainty of trying to build a career in a field that offered no guarantees, about her fear that she would eventually give in to pressure and pursue something more stable, more respectable. And as they talked, they both understood something essential. This night was perfect precisely because it was temporary. This connection, this understanding, this love, it existed in a bubble that was separate from the rest of their lives. To try to extend it, to try to build a life around it, would be to risk diminishing it, to risk transforming something transcendent into something ordinary. The sky began to lighten as dawn approached. The stars faded, replaced by the soft pink and gold of the approaching sunrise. Young Victor lay on the sand, his head resting on Olivia's shoulder, feeling the warmth of her body against his. He was not sleeping, but he was in a state of profound peace, a state of being so completely present that time seemed to lose all meaning. This moment, he thought, would be enough. This single night would be enough to sustain him for the rest of his life. But even as he thought it, he knew it wasn't true. Nothing could ever be enough after experiencing this. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps some moments were meant to exist in their perfection, untouched by the complications of ordinary life. The sun continued to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed almost unreal in their beauty. Young Victor drifted into sleep, his body finally surrendering to the exhaustion of an entire night spent in emotional intensity. His breathing became deep and regular, the sleep of someone who had experienced something so profound that his body had simply shut down to process it. Olivia remained awake, watching him sleep. She had been standing there for 10 minutes, perhaps longer, unable to bring herself to leave but knowing that she had to. She studied his face in the growing light, the way his features softened in sleep, the way his breathing was peaceful and undisturbed. She memorized every detail, knowing that this was a moment she would need to carry with her for the rest of her life. She was 21 years old. She had no stability, no future to offer. Victor was a Kensington, heir to a fortune, bound by obligations and expectations she could never fully understand. They had spent one perfect night together, and that night had shown her something essential about love, that it was possible to feel completely connected to another person, that it was possible to be truly understood. But she also understood, with the clarity that comes from youth and wisdom in equal measure, that some perfect things were meant to exist only in their perfection. To try to extend them, to try to build a life around them, would only diminish what they had been. She had made her decision during the night, though she hadn't articulated it to him. She would leave him sleeping. She would not exchange contact information or make promises about the future. She would preserve this night in its perfection, untouched by the complications of ordinary life. She would carry it with her always, a secret treasure that belonged only to her, a memory so vivid and so precious that it would sustain her through all the years to come. She left him a note, just a few words, nothing that could adequately capture what she felt, but something to let him know that the night had been real, that she had not simply vanished like a dream. She wrote about the ring, about how she had found what she was looking for, though not in the way she had expected. She wrote about gratitude, about the gift of being truly seen by another person. She wrote about love, though she didn't use that word directly. She wrote about the perfection of this night, about how some things were meant to exist only in their purity, untouched by time or circumstance. Then she walked away from the beach as the sun continued to rise, and she did not look back. She walked back toward the city, back toward her ordinary life, carrying with her the weight of a single perfect night that would reshape the entire trajectory of her existence. She did not know that Victor would spend the next 27 years searching for her, that he would build his entire life around the absence of her, that the memory of this night would haunt him with a sweetness so profound it bordered on pain. She did not know that she would do the same, that she would spend 27 years remembering the way he had looked at her, the way he had listened to her, the way he had made her feel like the most important person in the world. She did not know that every photograph she would take over the next 3 decades would be an attempt to capture the feeling of that night, to preserve in images what she could not preserve in reality. She did not know that fate would be kind enough to bring them together again, that the universe would offer them a second chance, that at 50 years old, she would walk into a museum and see his face across a crowded room and feel, in that instant, that 27 years had collapsed into nothing. But in that moment, walking away from the beach as the sun rose over the Atlantic, she knew only that she was doing the right thing. She knew only that some love was too perfect to be lived, that it was meant to exist only in memory, in the amber of consciousness, preserved forever in its original purity. Back in the museum, Victor felt the weight of that memory pressing down on him. 27 years had passed, and yet the feeling was as fresh, as vivid, as immediate as if it had happened yesterday. He could still smell the salt air of Coney Beach. He could still feel the warmth of her body against his. He could still hear the sound of her voice as she talked about her dreams and her fears. The memory released him as suddenly as it had seized him, and he found himself standing once again in the quiet corridor of the museum, looking at the woman who had haunted his consciousness for nearly 3 decades. She was older now, of course. There were lines around her eyes, threads of silver in her hair, but she was also exactly the same fundamental essence, the same quality of presence, the same capacity for genuine connection that had captivated him all those years ago. Neither of them moved to touch the other. There was something sacred about the space between them, something that suggested that crossing it might shatter the fragile reality of this moment. Instead, they simply stood there, 2 people in their 50s, looking at each other with the intensity of lovers who had been separated by time and circumstance, but never, not truly, by the heart. Around them, the museum continued its evening, oblivious to the fact that something fundamental was shifting in the universe, that two people who had been separated by time and circumstance were being given, impossibly, a second chance. The sun rose slowly over Coney Beach, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed almost unreal in their beauty. It was the kind of dawn that poets had tried to capture for centuries, that moment when darkness surrenders to light, when the world seems to pause between what was and what will be. The ocean was calm, its surface reflecting the colors of the sky like a mirror held up to heaven itself. The sand was cool beneath their bodies, still holding the memory of the night's coolness, though the warmth of the approaching day was beginning to seep through. Young Victor lay sleeping on the sand, his tuxedo jacket discarded nearby, his white dress shirt unbuttoned and rumpled. His breathing was deep and regular, the sleep of someone who had experienced something so profound that his body had simply surrendered to the need for rest. His face, relaxed in sleep, looked younger than his 23 years. The careful composure that he maintained during waking hours had fallen away, revealing something more vulnerable, more genuine. There was a slight smile on his lips, as if even in sleep, he was remembering the perfection of the night they had just shared. Olivia stood a few feet away, fully dressed now, her shoes in her hand, her eyes fixed on his sleeping face with an expression of such tenderness, such anguish, that it seemed to contain the entire spectrum of human longing. She had been standing there for 10 minutes, perhaps longer. She couldn't bring herself to leave, but she knew she had to. The decision had crystallized during the night, becoming clearer with each passing hour. She had made her choice, and now she had to have the courage to follow through with it. She studied him in the growing light, memorizing every detail as if she were framing a photograph through a camera lens. She noticed the way his dark hair fell across his forehead. She noticed the slight shadow of stubble on his jaw. She noticed the way his chest rose and fell with each breath, the way his hand lay open on the sand, as if reaching for something just beyond his grasp. She noticed all of it, knowing that this was a moment she would need to carry with her for the rest of her life. The love she felt for him in that moment was so intense, so overwhelming, that it felt almost unbearable. It was not the kind of love that could be easily articulated or explained. It was larger than desire, more fundamental than attraction. It was the sensation of recognizing your own soul in another person, of understanding that you had been incomplete your entire life without knowing it, and that now, having experienced wholeness, you would never be able to pretend that incompleteness was acceptable again. But that was precisely why she had to leave. Olivia had spent the entire night thinking about what came next. She had thought about it as they walked through the city, as they sat on the beach, as they held each other in the darkness. She had thought about the reality of their lives. Her life as a 21-year-old freelance photographer with no stability, no future to offer. His life as a Kensington heir, bound by obligations and expectations that she could never fully understand. She had thought about the way love could transform into something else when it encountered the friction of ordinary life, the way passion could curdle into resentment when it was forced to exist within the constraints of practical reality. She understood something that most people never learned until much later in life, if they learned it at all. Some love was too perfect to be lived. Some connections were meant to exist only in their purity, untouched by time or circumstance, or the slow erosion that came from trying to build ordinary life around extraordinary feeling. To try to extend this night into a future would be to diminish it, to transform it from something transcendent into something ordinary. And she could not bear the thought of that transformation. So she had decided, during the long hours of darkness, that she would leave him sleeping. She would not exchange contact information or make promises about the future. She would not allow this perfect thing to be corrupted by the complications of trying to maintain it in the real world. She would preserve this night in its perfection, untouched by the complications of ordinary life. She would carry it with her always, a secret treasure that belonged only to her, a memory so vivid and so precious that it would sustain her through all the years to come. The decision had brought with it a profound sadness, but also a strange kind of peace. She was choosing to let him go, choosing to let this go, not because she didn't love him, but precisely because she did. It was an act of love, she told herself, to walk away. It was an act of love to preserve what they had experienced in its original purity, rather than allowing it to be slowly degraded by the friction of reality. She had written the note during the early hours of the morning, while he slept. She had sat on the sand a few feet away from him, using the light from her phone to write on a piece of paper she'd found in her purse. The words had come slowly, painfully. How could she possibly capture what she felt? How could she explain her reasoning without making it sound like rejection, when it was actually the opposite? It was an act of profound love, a choice to honor what they had experienced by refusing to diminish it. In the end, she had written simply, "I found what I was looking for, though not in the way I expected. You gave me the greatest gift, the gift of being truly seen. I will carry this night with me always. Some perfect things are meant to exist only in their perfection. Thank you for showing me what love could be. Oh." She had folded the note carefully and placed it on his chest, where he would find it when he woke. She had wanted to leave something more, some way to contact her, some possibility of continuation. But she had resisted the urge. To do so would be to compromise the purity of her decision. If they were meant to find each other again, they would. If they weren't, then this night would be a perfect memory, untouched by the disappointment of failed attempts at reconnection. Now, in the growing light of dawn, she took one final look at him. She tried to memorize the exact shade of his skin in the morning light, the exact curve of his lips, the exact feeling of standing near him without touching him. She tried to imprint this moment so completely on her consciousness that she would be able to return to it at will, to relive it whenever she needed to remember what love felt like. Then, with a resolve that cost her more than she could have imagined, she turned away. She walked across the sand toward the street, her shoes still in her hand, her heart breaking with each step. She did not allow herself to look back. If she looked back, she knew she would lose her resolve. If she looked back, she would run back to him, wake him up, and try to figure out a way to make this work. And she could not do that. She could not compromise the perfection of what they had experienced by trying to extend it into a future that would inevitably tarnish it. She walked back toward the city as the sun continued to rise, and she did not look back. Back in the museum, Victor felt the full weight of that memory pressing down on him. 27 years had passed, and yet the feeling was as fresh, as vivid, as immediate, as if it had happened yesterday. He could still feel the cool sand beneath his body. He could still smell the salt air of Coney Beach. He could still feel the ache in his chest when he had woken up to find her gone, the note clutched in his hand, the realization that she had left him deliberately, that she had made a choice to walk away from him. He had spent the first few years after that night searching for her. He had gone back to the Plaza Hotel and asked the staff if they remembered her. He had tried to find her through photography circles in the city. He had hired a private investigator at one point, though he had eventually called off the search, realizing that if she had wanted to be found, she would have left him a way to find her. Over time, he had come to understand what she had done, and why. He had come to recognize that her departure had been an act of love, not rejection. She had understood something that he had not understood at the time, that some perfect things could not be extended into ordinary life without being diminished. She had chosen to preserve what they had experienced in its original purity, and in doing so, she had given him a gift that would sustain him for the rest of his life. He had married Catherine because it was expected of him, because it was the practical thing to do. He had built his business, raised his children, lived a life that was comfortable and respectable, and entirely devoid of the kind of passion and connection he had experienced during that single perfect night. But through it all, he had carried the memory of Olivia Rose with him. He had carried it like a secret, like a treasure. like a piece of his soul that he had left on a beach in Brooklyn all those years ago. And now, impossibly, she was standing before him. The woman he had never stopped loving. The woman who had shaped the entire emotional trajectory of his life. The woman who had shown him what love could be, and then had the courage to walk away from it to preserve its perfection. Olivia's hand came up to her chest, fingers splaying across the emerald fabric of her dress. It was a gesture of surprise, of emotion, of something too large to contain. Victor recognized it because he had seen her make similar gestures before. Small, unconscious movements that revealed the depth of her feeling in moments when words would have been inadequate. Neither of them moved to touch the other. There was something sacred about the space between them, something that suggested that crossing it might shatter the fragile reality of this moment. Instead, they simply stood there, two people in their 50s, looking at each other with the intensity of lovers who had been separated by time and circumstance but never, not truly, by the heart. Victor felt tears beginning to form in his eyes. He did not try to stop them. After 27 years of carrying this memory, after 27 years of wondering if he would ever see her again, after 27 years of building his life around the absence of her, she was here. She was real. She was present. And the love he felt for her in that moment was just as intense, just as overwhelming, just as all-consuming as it had been on that perfect night so many years ago. He understood now what she had understood then, that some love transcended time and circumstance, that some connections were so fundamental that they could not be erased by the passage of years or the accumulation of distance. He understood that the love he felt for her was not diminished by the 27 years that had passed. If anything, it had deepened, had become more profound, had taken on the quality of something that had been tested by time and had emerged stronger. Around them, the museum continued its evening, oblivious to the fact that something fundamental was shifting in the universe. The other guests moved through the halls, looking at paintings and sculptures, unaware that in this quiet corridor, two people were experiencing a moment of such profound emotional intensity that it seemed to alter the very nature of reality itself. Victor took a step toward her, then another. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the fragile reality of this moment. When he was close enough to speak, he found that he had no words. What does one say in such a moment? How does one bridge a gap of 27 years with language? How does one express the depth of love that has been preserved in memory, untouched and perfect, for nearly 3 decades? In the end, he simply said her name. He said it as a prayer, as a question, as an answer. He said it as if the simple act of speaking her name could bridge the distance between them, could collapse the years that had separated them, could restore what had been lost. She turned to face him fully, and their eyes met. In her gaze, he saw the reflection of his own emotion, the shock, the longing, the grief, and something else. Something that transcended the simple categories of human feeling. It was the look of someone confronting a ghost, or perhaps confronting the ghost of who they might have been. The love that had sustained them both for 27 years, the love that had existed in memory and in the quiet corners of their consciousness, suddenly became real again. It became tangible. It became present. And in that moment, neither of them could deny that what they had experienced on that single perfect night had never truly ended. It had simply been waiting, preserved in the amber of their memories, for the moment when fate would be kind enough to bring them together again. They left the museum without speaking. There was an unspoken understanding between them that what was happening required more than the sterile environment of a public space, more than the presence of other people moving through halls of art and history. Victor guided her toward the exit with a gentle hand on her elbow, not quite touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence, close enough that the years seemed to collapse into nothing. The October night air of Manhattan wrapped around them as they stepped onto Fifth Avenue. carrying with it the particular scent of the city at dusk, exhaust and expensive perfume, fallen leaves, and the faint aroma of roasted chestnuts from a street vendor on the corner. The city moved around them, taxis honking, people hurrying toward their destinations, the endless rhythm of New York at evening. But it all seemed distant, unreal, as if they were moving through the world in a bubble that contained only the two of them. They walked without destination, their feet carrying them through the familiar streets of the Upper East Side. Neither of them seemed to know where they were going, and neither of them appeared to care. The simple act of being in proximity to each other seemed to be enough, a kind of miracle in itself, after so many years of absence. They walked past the brownstones where they had walked together all those years ago, past the same streets that had witnessed their first perfect night, and it was as if time had folded back on itself, as if the past and present had become one continuous moment. Eventually, they found themselves at a small park, one of those hidden gems that existed in the spaces between Manhattan's more famous landmarks. It was nearly empty at this hour, with only a few people scattered on benches, lost in their own thoughts and concerns. They sat on a bench near the edge of the park, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. They simply sat there, side by side, not touching, but aware of each other's presence with an intensity that made the silence feel full rather than empty. Olivia's eyes were fixed on the trees, on the way the streetlights filtered through the branches, on the way the city's light transformed the natural world into something both familiar and strange. Victor watched her, unable to look away, afraid that if he blinked, she might disappear, that this moment might prove to be nothing more than a particularly vivid dream from which he would eventually wake. The weight of 27 years pressed down on them both. All the moments they hadn't shared, all the conversations they hadn't had, all the life that had happened in the space between that perfect night and this impossible reunion. Victor thought about the woman he had married, the children they had raised, the comfortable predictability of a life lived according to expectation rather than desire. He thought about all the times he had wanted to search for Olivia again, all the times he had stopped himself, telling himself that it was better to preserve the memory than to risk tarnishing it with reality. But now she was here. Real, present, tangible in a way that memory could never be. Olivia thought about the photographs she had taken over the past 27 years. Thousands of them. She had spent her career trying to capture moments of genuine human connection, trying to preserve beauty and truth in images. But she had always known, on some level, that she was searching for something else. That she was trying to recapture the feeling of that single, perfect night, trying to find in her work what she had lost when she walked away from the beach at dawn. She had built a successful career as a photographer. She had traveled the world, captured important moments, had her work displayed in galleries and museums. She had lived a full life, a meaningful life. But there had always been a space inside her that remained unfilled, a space that had been shaped by Victor Kensington, and that no amount of professional success or personal accomplishment could satisfy. And now he was here. The man she had loved and left, the man she had thought about every single day for 27 years, the man who had haunted her consciousness like a beautiful ghost. After what might have been minutes, or might have been hours, Olivia turned to look at him. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and her expression held a complexity of emotion that Victor recognized because he felt it too. Shock, longing, grief, and something else. Something that transcended the simple categories of human feeling. She reached out her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, he took it. The touch was electric, familiar in a way that transcended the simple fact of physical contact. It was as if their bodies remembered what their minds had never forgotten, the particular resonance of two people who had been made for each other, even if the universe had conspired to keep them apart. The love that had sustained them both for 27 years, the love that had existed in memory and in the quiet corners of their consciousness, suddenly became real again, It became tangible. It became present. And in that moment, neither of them could deny that what they had experienced on that single perfect night had never truly ended. It had simply been waiting, preserved in the amber of their memories, for the moment when fate would be kind enough to bring them together again. Victor thought about the note she had left him all those years ago. He had kept it, had read it countless times over the decades until the paper had become worn and fragile. I found what I was looking for, though not in the way I expected. You gave me the greatest gift, the gift of being truly seen. I will carry this night with me always. Some perfect things are meant to exist only in their perfection. Thank you for showing me what love could be. He had spent years being angry at her for leaving, years trying to understand her reasoning. But eventually, he had come to understand that she had been right. She had understood something that he had not understood at the time. That some perfect things could not be extended into ordinary life without being diminished. She had chosen to preserve what they had experienced in its original purity, and in doing so, she had given him a gift that would sustain him for the rest of his life. But now, holding her hand in the darkness of the park, Victor understood something else. The perfection of that night did not have to be diminished by what came next. The love they had experienced did not have to be corrupted by the complications of trying to build a life around it. They were no longer the people they had been at 21 and 23. They had lived full lives, had accumulated wisdom and experience and understanding. They had learned what mattered and what didn't. They had learned what was worth fighting for and what was worth letting go of. And perhaps, Victor thought, this second chance was not meant to recreate what they had experienced all those years ago. Perhaps it was meant to be something different, something that honored the perfection of that first night, while also acknowledging the depth and complexity that came from having lived separate lives for 27 years. Olivia squeezed his hand gently, and he turned to look at her. In her eyes, he saw the reflection of his own realization. She had come to the same understanding. The past could not be recreated, but it could be honored. The love they had felt for each other could not be extended backward into ordinary life, but it could be allowed to exist in the present moment, in all its complexity and depth and hard-won wisdom. They sat together in the darkness, holding hands, not speaking, but communicating in the language of presence and attention and genuine recognition. Around them, the city continued its endless motion, but they remained still, suspended in a moment that seemed to exist outside of time. Later, they would exchange phone numbers. Later, they would begin the slow process of getting to know each other again, of discovering who they had become in the years since that perfect night. Later, they would have to navigate the complications of their separate lives, the relationships they had built, the obligations they had accumulated. Later, there would be difficult conversations and complex decisions, and the kind of real-world complications that had no easy solutions. But in this moment, sitting in the darkness of a Manhattan park, holding the hand of the person they had loved for 27 years, neither of them thought about any of that. In this moment, they simply existed together. Two people who had been separated by time and circumstance, but never, not truly, by the heart. The love that had shaped their entire lives, the love that had existed in memory and in the quiet corners of their consciousness, had finally been given permission to exist in the present moment. And in that permission, in that recognition, in that second chance that fate had granted them, they found something that transcended explanation or understanding. They found home. In the end, love doesn't measure itself by the time we spend together, but by the depth of connection we carry within us. And sometimes, when we're brave enough to let go of what we love, the universe finds a way to give it back to us. Transformed, deepened, and more precious than we ever imagined it could be.